Beep, 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 beep. Oh, hey, welcome back to another Storytime video, everyone! Oh, today's story is a real good one. It stars a very famous character that I'm sure you already know. Let's see this book. It's called... Curious George! It's Curious George. This is the very first Curious George book ever written, way back in 1941. That was a very long time ago. Well, let's get started right away, shall we? Curious George by H.A. Ray. Okay, before we start, I just have to say I really like the way that this book is formatted. We got the words on one side and the pictures on the other. Now that is a very great way to format a book, and I wish more books were formatted this way. This is George. He lived in Africa. He was a good little monkey and always very curious. One day, George saw a man. He had on a large yellow straw hat. The man saw George too. What a nice little monkey, he thought. I would like to take him home with me. He put his hat on the ground, and of course, George was curious. He came down from the tree to look at the large yellow hat. The hat had been on the man's head. George thought it would be nice to have it on his own head. He picked it up and put it on. The hat covered George's head. He couldn't see. The man picked him up quickly and popped him into a bag. George was caught. The man with the big yellow hat put George into a little boat, and a sailor rowed them both across the water to a big ship. George was sad, but he was still a little curious. On the big ship, things began to happen. The man took off the bag. George sat on a little stool, and the man said, "George, I'm going to take you to a big zoo in the big city. You will like it there. Now run along and play, but don't get into trouble." George promised to be good, but it's very easy for little monkeys to forget. On the deck, he found some seagulls. He wondered how they could fly. He was very curious. Finally, he had to try. It looked easy, but... oh, what happened? First this. He tries to fly. And then this. He falls right into the ocean, right next to all the little fishies. Where is George? The sailors looked and looked. At last they saw him struggling in the water and almost all tired out. "Man overboard!" the sailors cried as they threw him a lifebelt. George caught it and held on. At last he was safe on board. And you can see here in this illustration, he is spitting out the fish. After that, George was more careful to be a good monkey, until at last the long trip was over. George said goodbye to the kind sailors, and he and the man with the yellow hat walked off the ship and onto the shore, and onto the city to the man's house. After a good meal and a good pipe, George felt very tired. Oh boy, you could tell that this book was written in the 1940s. Back then, everyone smoked a pipe. That was before we realized that is not very good for you now, is it? Don't try that. He crawled into a bed and fell asleep at once. The next morning, the man telephoned the zoo. George watched him. He was fascinated. Then the man went away. George was curious. He wanted to telephone too. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. What fun! Ding-a-ling-a-ling! George had telephoned the fire station! The firemen rushed to the telephone. "Hello? Hello?" they said, but there was no answer. Then they looked for the signal on the big map that showed where the telephone call had come from. They didn't know it was George. They thought it was a real fire. "Hurry, hurry, hurry!" The firemen jumped onto their fire engines and onto their hook and ladders. Ding dong, ding dong, everyone out of the way! Hurry, hurry, hurry! The firemen rushed into the house. They opened the door. No fire! Only a naughty little monkey. "Oh, catch him, they cried. George tried to run away. He almost did, but he got caught in the telephone wire, and... a thin fireman caught one arm, and a fat fireman caught the other. "You fooled the fire department," they said. "We will have to shut you up where you can't do any more harm." They took him away and shut him in a prison. Oh no! George wanted to get out. He climbed up to the window to try the bars. Just then, the watchman came in. He got on the wooden bed to try to catch George, but he was too big and heavy. The bed tipped over, the watchman fell over, and quick as lightning, George ran out through the open door. He hurried through the building and out onto the roof, and then he was lucky to be a monkey. Out he walked onto the telephone wires, quickly and quietly over the guard's head. George walked away. He was free! Down in the street, outside the prison wall, stood a balloon man. A little girl bought a balloon for her brother. George watched. He was curious again. He felt he must have a bright red balloon. He reached over and tried to help himself, but instead of one balloon, the whole bunch broke loose. In an instant, the wind whisked them all away, and with them went George, holding tight with both hands. Up, up he sailed, higher and higher. The houses looked like toy houses, and the people like dolls. George was frightened. He held on very tight. Well, in this picture he looks rather excited rather than frightened. At first the wind blew in great gusts. Then it quieted. Finally it stopped blowing altogether. George was very tired. Down, down he went, bump onto the top of a traffic light. Everyone was surprised. The traffic got all mixed up. George didn't know what to do. And then he heard someone call, "George!" He looked down and saw his friend, the man with the big yellow hat. George was very happy. The man was happy too. George slid down the post and the man with the big yellow hat put him under his arm. Then he paid the balloon man for all the balloons. And then George and the man climbed into the car, and at last away they went. To the zoo! What a nice place for George to live. The end. Well, that was a rather exciting story. I'd say it still pretty much holds up even after all these years. And clearly it did, because Curious George is one of the most famous characters of all time. I'm sure he's still making television shows and appearing in new books all the way to this day. Well, thanks for reading the very first story with me. I'll see you again next week. Thanks for stopping by.